D.Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, first Marquis of Pombal, first Count of Oeiras, was an 18th-century Portuguese statesman. He was Secretary of the State of Internal Affairs of the Kingdom in the government of Joseph I of Portugal from 1750 to 1777. Undoubtedly the most prominent minister in the government, he is considered today to have been the de facto head of government. Pombal is notable for his swift and competent leadership in the aftermath of the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. He implemented sweeping economic policies in Portugal to regulate commercial activity and standardize quality throughout the country. Pombal was instrumental in weakening the grip of the Inquisition. The term Pombaline is used to describe not only his tenure, but also the architectural style which was adopted after the Great Earthquake. Pombal, who was considered an estrangero, introduced many fundamental administrative, educational, economic, and ecclesiastical reforms justified in the name of reason, and instrumental in advancing secularization. However, historians argue that Pombal's enlightenment, while far-reaching, was primarily a mechanism for enhancing autocracy at the expense of individual liberty, and especially an apparatus for crushing opposition, suppressing criticism, and furthering colonial economic exploitation, as well as intensifying print censorship and consolidating personal control and profit. Early life. Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo was born in Lisbon, the son of Manuel de Carvalho e Atide, a country squire with properties in the Leiria region, and of his wife Teresa Luisa de Mendonça e Melo. During his youth he studied at the University of Coimbra and then served briefly in the army. He then moved to Lisbon and eloped with Teresa de Mendonça e Almada, the niece of the Count of Oeiras. The marriage was a turbulent one, as she had married him against her family's wishes. Her parents made life unbearable for the young couple. They eventually moved to Melo properties near Pombal. Political career. In 1738, Pombal received his first public appointment as the Portuguese ambassador to Great Britain. In 1745, he served as the Portuguese ambassador to Austria. The Queen Consort of Portugal, Archduchess Mary Ann Josepha of Austria, was fond of him. After his first wife died, she arranged for him to marry the daughter of the Austrian Field Marshal Leopold Joseph, Count von Dorn. The king, John V, was not pleased, however, and recalled him in 1749. John V died the following year and his son Joseph I of Portugal was crowned king. Joseph I was fond of Melo. With the Queen Mother's approval he appointed him as Minister of Foreign Affairs. As the king's confidence in him increased, the king entrusted him with more control of the state. In 1740 he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. By 1755, the king appointed him Prime Minister. Impressed by English economic success which he had witnessed as ambassador, Pombal successfully implemented similar economic policies in Portugal. He abolished slavery in Portugal and the Portuguese colonies in India, reorganized the army and the navy, abolished the autos de refiocute and ended the limpeza de sangue civil statutes and the discrimination against New Christians, the Jews that had converted to Christianity, and the descendants regardless of genealogical distance, in order to escape the Portuguese Inquisition. Pombaline reforms. The Pombaline reforms were a series of reforms with the goal of making Portugal an economically self-sufficient and commercially strong nation, by means of expanding Brazilian territory, streamlining the administration of colonial Brazil, and fiscal and economic reforms both in the colony and in Portugal. During the Age of Enlightenment, Portugal was considered small and unprogressive. It was a country of 3 million people in 1750. 200,000 people lived in the nation's 538 monasteries. The economy of Portugal before the reforms was a relatively stable one, though it had become dependent on colonial Brazil for much of its economic support, and England for much of its manufacturing support. Based on the Methuen Treaty of 1703. Even exports from Portugal went mostly through expatriate merchants like the English port wine shippers and French businessmen like Jacques Ratin, whose memoirs are scathing about the efficiency of his Portuguese counterparts. The need to grow a manufacturing sector in Portugal was made more imperative by the excessive spending of the Portuguese crown. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake, the expenditures on wars with Spain for South American territories, and the exhaustion of gold mines and diamond mines in Brazil. His greatest reforms were, however, economic and financial, with the creation of several companies and guilds to regulate every commercial activity. He created the Douro Wine Company, which demarcated the Douro wine region for production of port. To ensure the wine's quality, his was the first attempt to control wine quality and production in Europe. He ruled with a heavy hand, imposing strict laws upon all classes of Portuguese society, from the high nobility to the poorest working class, and via his widespread review of the country's tax system. These reforms gained him enemies in the upper classes, especially among the high nobility, who despised him as a social upstart. Further important reforms were carried out in education by Pombal. He expelled the Jesuits in 1759, created the basis for secular public primary and secondary schools, introduced vocational training, created hundreds of new teaching posts, added departments of mathematics and natural sciences to the University of Coimbra, and introduced new taxes to pay for these reforms. Lisbon earthquake. Disaster fell upon Portugal on the morning of November 1, 1755, when Lisbon was awakened by a violent earthquake with an estimated magnitude of 9 on the Richter scale. The city was razed by the earthquake and ensuing tsunami and fires. Melo survived by a stroke of luck and, unshaken, immediately took upon the task of rebuilding the city, with his famous quote, "What now? We bury the dead and heal the living." Despite the calamity, Lisbon suffered no epidemics and, within less than a year, was already partially rebuilt. The new central area of Lisbon was designed by a group of architects specifically to resist subsequent earthquakes, employing a new construction method, caging, which consisted of a wooden framework erected in the early stages of construction, granting the building a better chance of withstanding an earthquake due to the inherent flexibility of the material. Architectural models were built for tests with the effects of an earthquake being simulated by marching troops around the models. The buildings and major squares of the Pombaline downtown of Lisbon are one of its main attractions. They are the world's first earthquake-resistant buildings. Melo made also an important contribution to the study of seismology by designing a survey that was sent to every parish in the country. The questionnaire asked whether dogs or other animals behaved strangely prior to the earthquake, whether there was a noticeable difference in the rise or fall of the water level in wells, and how many buildings had been destroyed and what kind of destruction had occurred. The answers have allowed modern Portuguese scientists to reconstruct the event with precision. Spanish invasion. In 1761, Spain concluded an alliance with France by which Spain would enter the 7 Years' War in an effort to prevent British hegemony. The two countries saw Portugal as Britain's closest ally, due to the Treaty of Windsor, as part of a wider plan to isolate and defeat Britain. Spanish and French envoys were sent to Lisbon to demand that the King and Pombal agree to cease all trade cooperation with with Britain to face war. While Pombal was keen to make Portugal less dependent on Britain, this was a long-term goal, and he and the king rejected the Bourbon ultimatum. On May 5, 1762, Spain sent troops across the border and penetrated into Trás-os-Montes in order to capture Oporto, but they were repelled by the guerrillas and forced to abandon all their conquests. But Chaves, after suffering huge losses there by the Spanish general Nicolas de Carvajal, Marquis of Sarria, soon lost the Spanish king's confidence, and was replaced by Count of Oeiras. In a second invasion, a combined Franco-Spanish army was initially successful in capturing Almeida and several almost undefended fortresses, but they were soon grounded to a halt by a small Anglo-Portuguese force magnificently entrenched in the hills east of Abrantes. Pombal had sent urgent messages to London requesting military assistance, and 7,104 British troops were sent together with William, Count of Schomberg-Lippe, and some of its military staff, to organize the Portuguese army. Victory in the battles of Valencia de Alcantara and Vila Velha, and above all a scorched earth tactic coupled with guerrilla actions in their communication and logistic lines, induced starvation and the disintegration of the Franco-Spanish army, whose relics were driven back and pursued until Spain. The Spanish headquarters was taken by a Portuguese force under Townshend, and all the strongholds that had previously been occupied by the Bourbon invaders were retaken, with the exception of Almeida. A third Spanish offensive in the Alentejo also met defeat in Orihuela, Marvo and Coda Serra. The invaders were chased again back into Spain and saw several men captured by the advancing Allies. According to a report sent to the British government by British ambassador in Portugal, Edward Hay, the Bourbon armies had suffered 30,000 casualties during their invasion of Portugal. In the Treaty of Paris, Spain had to restore to Portugal Chaves and Almeida plus all the territory taken from Portugal in South America in 1763. Only the second was given back, while the vast territory of Rio Grande do Sul would be reconquered from Spain in the undeclared Hispano-Portuguese War of 1763 to 1777. However, Portugal also conquered Spanish territory in South America during the 7 Years' War, most of the Rio Negro Valley, and defeated a Spanish invasion aiming to occupy the right bank of the Guaporé River, and also in the Battle of Santa Barbara, Rio Grande do Sul. Portugal was able to keep all these territorial gains in the years after the invasion, and despite the crucial British assistance, Pombal began to be increasingly concerned at the rise of British power. Despite being an Anglophile, he suspected the British coveted Brazil, and he was alarmed by the seeming ease by which they had taken Havana and Manila from Spain in 1762. As noted by historian Andreas Luch, during Pombal's reign Portugal faced foreign threats, such as the Spanish invasion during the 7 Years' War in 1762. Even if Portugal was able to defeat the Spanish with the help of the British allies, this war of Spain and France against British hegemony made him concerned about Portuguese independence and Portugal's colonies. Anti-Jesuit, having lived outside of Portugal in Vienna and London, the latter city in particular being a major center of the Enlightenment, Melo increasingly believed that the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, had a grip on science and education, and that they were an inherent drag on an independent, Portuguese-style Illuminismo. He was especially familiar with the anti-Jesuit tradition of Britain, and in Vienna he had made friends with Gerhard van Swieten, a confidant of Maria Theresa of Austria and a staunch adversary of the Austrian Jesuits' influence. As Prime Minister, Melo engaged the Jesuits in a propaganda war, which was watched closely by the rest of Europe. and he launched a number of conspiracy theories regarding the order's desire for power. During the Tavora affair, he accused the Society of Jesus of treason and attempted regicide, a major public relations catastrophe for the order. In the age of absolutism, the Jesuits and their apologists emphasized the Society's role in trying to protect Native Americans in the Portuguese and Spanish colonies, and the fact that the limitations placed upon the order resulted in the so-called Guarani War, in which the Guarani tribesmen were decimated by Spanish and Portuguese troops. However, at the time, such arguments counted for far less than charges connected with the Jesuits' alleged activities in Europe. Pombal named his brother, D. Paulo Antonio de Carvalho e Mendonça, chief inquisitor, and used the Inquisition against the Jesuits. Pombal was thus an important precursor for the suppression of the Jesuits throughout Europe and its colonies, which culminated in 1773, when European absolutists forced Pope Clement XIV to issue a bull empowering them to suppress the order in the domains. Expulsion of the Jesuits and consolidation of power. Following the earthquake, Joseph I gave his prime minister even more authority. Melo became a powerful, progressive dictator. As his power grew, his enemies increased in number, and bitter disputes with the high nobility became frequent. In 1758, Joseph I was wounded in an attempted assassination when he was returning from a visit to his mistress, the young Tavora Marchioness. The Tavora family and the Duke of Aveiro were implicated, and they were executed after a quick trial. There were long-standing tensions between the Portuguese crown and the Jesuits, so that the Tavora affair could be considered a pretext for the climax to the conflict that resulted in the Jesuits' expulsion from the Portugal and its empire in 1759. Jesuit assets were confiscated by the Crown. According to historians James Lockhart and Stuart Schwartz, the Jesuits' independence, power, wealth, control of education, and ties to Rome made the Jesuits obvious targets for Pombal's brand of extreme regalism. Melo showed no mercy, prosecuting every person involved, even women and children. This was the final stroke that broke the power of the aristocracy and ensured the Prime Minister's victory against his enemies. In reward for his swift resolve, Joseph I made his loyal minister Count of Oeiras in 1759. Following the Tavora affair, the new Count of Oeiras knew no opposition. Having become the Marquis of Pombal in 1770, he effectively ruled Portugal until Joseph I's death in 1777. Decline and death. King Joseph's successor, Queen Maria I of Portugal, loathed the Marquis. She was a devout woman and was influenced by the Jesuits, and upon her ascension to the throne, she did what she had long vowed to do. She withdrew all his political offices. She also issued one of history's first restraining orders, commanding that the Marquis not be closer than 20 miles to her presence. If she were to travel near his estates, he was compelled to remove himself from his house to fulfill the royal decree. The slightest reference in her hearing to Pombal is said to have induced fits of rage in the Queen. Pombal built a palace in Oeiras, designed by Carlos Mardel. The palace featured formal French gardens enlivened with traditional Portuguese glazed tile walls. There were waterfalls and waterworks set within vineyards. Pombal died peacefully on his estate at Pombal in 1782. A controversial figure in his own era. Today one of Lisbon's busiest squares and the busiest underground station is named Marquês de Pombal in his honor. There is an imposing statue of the Marquis depicting a lion next to him in the square as well. João Francisco de Saldanha Oliveira e Dawn, 1st Duke of Saldanha, was his grandson.